Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker. I've got Doug Braun-Harvey back with me today to kind of do a wrap-up of the healthy sexual principles that we've been talking about, and we'll see whether or not this is our last one, because I'm always excited to talk about something else as long as he'll have me.
Hello, Natasha. It's good to be back. Now, let me just do a sequence.
Yes.
It's sexual health and not healthy sexuality principles. And we can chat a bit more about why that's important, but the language sequence is important.
Go for it.
Well, healthy sexuality tends to be a more binary way of thinking. There are healthy ways of being and unhealthy ways of being. And so it sort of creates a kind of schism of one category of healthy and one category of not healthy. And that tends to be a very common way act-centered systems organize sexuality. There are approved of and disapproved ways of being sexual. So healthy sexuality, that phrase actually comes from that perspective, where sexual health is really a perspective of a kind of principled ideas that don't have a right or wrong. There's sort of an agreement that they're essential fundamental ideas. And then each person has to figure out how do they relate to these ideas, not from a side-taking or position-taking solution that one's had as a correct answer and one doesn't. So I find myself particularly interested in that sequence and talking with sex therapists and other people that languaging really makes a difference.
I think that's really wonderful that we kind of inadvertently started that way, because I think that goes into a lot of what we'll be talking about today are exactly what you just said. And I think that, yes, when you point that out, you know, the even just the term healthy sexuality has a feeling of moral overlay over it, right? So like you said, who gets to decide what's healthy?
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually the question that got me started as a sex therapist. I wanted to know, what is healthy sexuality?
Mm-hmm.
Am I being biased in the way that I look at healthy sexuality, you know, coming from Mormonism myself and my ideas about what it means to be a healthy sexual person? So having that turn around on us in a language perspective, granted, you know, you get a lot more questions and you get answers as usual in my training.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's never ended.
Yeah.
And yet I think, like you're saying, it allows for more freedom. It allows for more self-authority. I think it allows for more partner authority for each partnership is different. Each relationship is different. And what might be considered edifying or healthy for one person is not always necessarily the case for the other. So it just allows for a lot more room. So I appreciate you starting us off with that.
Yeah. You know, what I like about our conversation is that I could say this to you and it would be a welcomed exchange of contemplation. You know, because I could certainly say this in other places, Natasha, and it would be the beginning of a
debate.
A debate, or it could be a distancing moment. How's that? And what I've so enjoyed about our conversations is we've just had a mutual exchange that we're very interested in each other as having to say. And I just find that really, really refreshing. I've been speaking to people around the country, and several people have been asking me, are the sexual health principles, how would these work in religious communities? And I said, well, I've been doing a 6 or 7 part podcast on the sexual health principles and how they apply within the Mormon faith. And people are shocked that that not only I have an answer, but I'm actually involved in the conversation.
I think that's wonderful. That's so good.
And I love being able to
happy that you feel that way about these interchanges with each other. So I've really enjoyed them as well. So, and one thing that, I mean, because I can be feisty, you know, believe it or not, I can be debateful. I can have strong opinions. So I'm glad that I'm not necessarily in that space with you. I'm really glad I'm able to be open to all of that. So thank you.
Well, I've watched you do this in the willingness kind of debate, and you're advocating to protect minors from non-consensual and exploitive dynamics within a ritual, within a religion. And I think those are really important conversations. Religious rituals are important and essential elements of all faith communities, but they also need to be held to standards of consent and non-exploitation. That's a universal sexual health principles that, some communities are not immune from. And I feel like you're really standing up to that conversation and saying these sexual health principles matter in those rooms too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the topic today is how do we handle, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the 6 principles. And so now it's about how do we handle it when these principles are either in conflict with one another or potentially even, somebody doesn't agree with the principles or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we've covered this a little bit here and there all along. And yet I thought it would be really interesting to spend a whole podcast on it. And I've thought through some scenarios that I definitely want to cover, and maybe you'll think of others where this tends to come up. But as I've been writing about sexual relationships for, like a decade now through my blog and things like that, a lot of times, even before I was aware of these particular principles, the way that you've languaged them, I would write about things like honesty, communication, trust, shared values, these types of things that seem to make sense, for most people if they want to have quote unquote healthy relationships, or at least relationships that are edifying to both partners. And oftentimes I would get pushback that it was too ideal. I was being too ideal. In other words,
how did you hear that? What do you think the person was saying to you?
Well, I think what they were saying is, well, sure, it'd be nice if I could communicate with my partner without them going, off the rails and divorcing me. And, if I'm really honest about my sexuality, it's going to be way too scary, or my partner isn't interested in that type of sexuality, or isn't interested in my history, or my history even will be part of creating a wedge between us, even in libido difference partnerships, to be able to, for the high libido partner to be able to say, hey, my sexuality matters. That's not going to be okay with the low libido partner, because now you're prioritizing sex over love, or sex over me, or you're pressuring me, and vice versa, that argument can go the other way around. So it seemed like in a lot of these scenarios, people would push back and just say, well, thanks for the answer, but that wasn't super helpful.
So what I'm hearing, if I deconstruct a bit what you mean by pushback, and I went with your examples, is what I hear people saying to you is these principles are really, useful ideas, but they also have consequences. I think what they're saying by you're being ideal is perhaps they're thinking we're not representing the consequences for living by these principles. And I hear each of those scenarios, the person telling you, here's the fallout of this. Here's the negative consequences from abiding by sexual health principles. And I think that that's real. There are real consequences for upholding principles. And that's what I hear in all those stories. And so that the pushback might be what you're addressing here in today's conversation. Now let's look at the consequences.
Yes.
These are not just all good news stories.
Yes.
because you embrace the principles of sexual health. And I think we have to kind of acknowledge that. There's pain for living through sexual health. There's loss of love by abiding by sexual health. Not everybody's interested in living their framework of life through the principles of sexual health. And what do we do when there's that difference?
Okay, I love that already. That's a very helpful framing, because I agree. It's not, maybe it's about realistic expectations. It's not just me saying, oh, have shared values and you'll hold hands and run off into the rainbow, right? It's kind of like, here's a principle and there's a lot of work around this principle, and this principle may have unintended consequences. And this is actually very apropos to the work I do in faith transitions. When people, for example, have to face that decision about whether or not they're going to be honest about their belief system changing, with their spouse or with their community, and the consequences that come with that. Because again, most of the time that doesn't go without consequences. Now some people handle that type of information better than others, but usually something shifts, and that's very hard, and why people remain quiet or silent, oftentimes for decades, before.
So the solution to that conundrum is quiet.
Silence.
Right? Silence, right? So we could talk about what does that look like when people have conflicts in sexual health principles and their solution is silence.
Yeah.
What's the consequence of that decision?
Right, because that's exactly right. It's not like one choice has consequences and one doesn't.
That's right.
Both have consequences. So,
That's right.
And in fact, there was just a research article I linked to somewhere, when people hide their religious beliefs, that there's been a correlate to depression.
Mm-hmm.
So, when people are trying to like fake it, right? So that they don't, and that makes sense. I mean, because you're not being your authentic self, you're not able to really talk about who you are and share your ideas and values with the people that matter the most to you. And so
silence is not an infrequent solution to keeping an attachment. What we're really talking about is attachment keeping strategies.
Mm.
If one's belief or values or ideas about life that are central notions of how they live change, and that change threatens primary attachments, a lot of times people keep the attachment.
Mm-hmm.
These are the solutions that people come up with.
Right.
And there are consequences for that solution, just like there are consequences for the solution of being transparent about one's change in values and the potential loss and what I call the severing response, that the ultimate solution to these differences is to sever the relationship. And oftentimes, in many systems, the severing response is a clearly stated option that can be utilized as a way to solve differences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I was at the ASECT Winter Institute on Sexuality and Religion, and we looked at sacred scripture from variety of sacred texts from a variety of religions, it was interesting to see how in scripture, many times in these sacred texts, the solution to intractable sexual differences or violations of fundamental sexual laws, typically women's sexuality, violating the laws of the religion of the land, was death. Which is a severing response. It's just another severing response. It's the most severe one there is. Right. But it's the ultimate severing response. Just like suicide is the ultimate severing response for the individual to direct inward. Homicide is the ultimate sexual severing solution outward. But when end of life is presented as a solution to these intractable differences, it creates a different feeling for people. And a less severe, that's the most severe, but a less severe is the loss of attachment, the severing of one's relationship with meaningful attachments. And for many people, that is really a serious consequence that is terrifying and fearful and a level of pain that's beyond imagination. And people will do amazing things to hold on to their attachments.
Sure. Well, we're wired for attachment, right? We're wired for our survival depends on attachment. And so there's reasons why we have that. I think a lot of times people self-shame about that. Like I'm codependent, or I shouldn't be that, responsible for feeling this way. And yet I think we're wired for that.
Well, how people maintain their attachments very widely. But I think sexual health principles and the struggling with, aligning one's life with sexual health principles, one of the primary conflicts that will emerge is the loss of an attachment by aligning oneself or moving towards more of an alignment with one of the sexual health principles. And one of them we just chatted about before the broadcast was, this conflict between values and honesty. When my values change, which you were talking about, and then my interest in wanting to have authentic and honest relationships. And then when I reveal and I'm transparent about these changes, a consequence could be the loss of the relationship.
Right. Yeah, and that happens through divorce. It can happen through excommunication. The church can do it to you. It can happen through kind of family rejection, where family members are ousted from being able to see their own family members, et cetera. So there's lots of different ways to do that. There's probably less drastic ways to do that as well, where people continue the attachment and yet maybe how they would describe it is there's a wedge there that they don't know how to get beyond. And so they're kind of cohabitating or living roommates. You often hear the phrase from couples that are frustrated with the lack of intimacy that they're experiencing. So, yeah.
So these are all, big ideas, but I'm curious about what sort of on the ground situations.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get started.
Yeah.
So my first one is more from the therapist perspective that I'd like to, and I came up with all these because quite frankly, I struggle with them. So I'm not saying that I have the best solutions or answers to these. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about them. So I've definitely had
podcast as consultation.
Yeah,
it's
this
transparent.
Is podcast consultation.
I like your honesty.
Help. Well, and I've taken strong positions on many of these things. And then, and then I have to, double back and say, well, am I being too rigid in my own thinking about some of these things? Just because, I see the fallout or the consequences. So the first one has to do more with the therapists themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way I can think about this is that there are certain scenarios that come through our office where, because I think, when you think about principles that a therapist is trying to negotiate, on the one hand, we're psychoeducators. So that's a role that we play. On the other hand, another role that we play is a validator, right? Or a person who is going to be safe for you to speak with about really whatever you want to talk about. Mm-hmm. And then a third part of that, I think, is a recognition that even though we may have different values, I'm going to respect yours. Mm-hmm. So those three things sound very nice, and yet come into conflict with each other, I think, all the time. So, for example, if I have a man in my office who says, I really enjoy beating my wife, get a lot of pleasure out of that, and I believe that, I have a right to do that. The Bible tells me so, my interpretation of the Bible anyway, and I don't see any issue with that. And I would like for you to help convince my partner here that she should be okay with that, right? So that would be kind of a dramatic, I've actually never had that happen to me. Uh-huh. But I think that most therapists would probably not necessarily pick the principle of I'm going to respect your values. I think that they would pick the principle of psychoeducation and, carefully and in a respectful way, maybe challenging some of those ideas and how they don't really fit with maybe the law or our, other ideas of health in regards to mental health, etc. I see a lot less willingness from therapists to do this with sexual principles. And I wonder why, and even with the idea of like another.
Can you say a little more? I see less willingness for therapists to do this with sexual health principles. That's a great sentence. I'm curious what that means to you or what you've observed.
I think that we have a little bit more anxiety around sexuality in general. I think that we want to be very careful not to overstep in the values department when it comes to sexuality. Mm-hmm. And I think we want to respect religion and religious differences. And I'll even be very transparent that I'd probably be much more comfortable challenging my own religious values than somebody else's. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I had a couple who was Muslim in my office, I'd probably be much more willing to be curious or understand where they're coming from before I ever try to challenge anything, which is appropriate because I don't come from that background. Mm-hmm. At the same time, so I guess what I'm getting at is that there are issues, in my opinion, that are just as harmful as the battering spouse within sexuality. For example, when we make something like masturbation a sin, when we make same-sex relationships that are sexual a sin, when we have these types of ideas.
Can I just interrupt? I want to see what it's like to rework those sentences.
Okay.
When we make masturbation a sin, I like to think about it from a relationship perspective. When I have aligned myself with a faith system that believes this sexual behavior is a sin.
Yeah, so where I struggle with that, and I'll just tell you right away where I struggle with it, is that I don't necessarily see a 12-year-old child able to developmentally align themselves with a faith. I see them, and that's their culture, that's their family. I mean, maybe when you're 40, or 45, and you can finally start saying, okay, I'm choosing to stay in this religion, or I'm choosing to continue to align myself with these ideas that maybe now I have the developmental ability to challenge at some level. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that I see religious belief, at least at first, as a choice, as much as a cultural framing that you are born into for the most part.
Right.
And then
this is true for everybody in the world.
Yes. Okay. So that's my only pushback about the word aligning with.
Okay, so then we have to think about what is the consequences for parents choosing to align their parenting sexual health values with the religion they are living in. And are they thinking about the consequences that has for their child's development? And what happens when your religious beliefs might be in conflict with what you believe are maybe not so useful sexual health messages for a child? So in other words, if it is a 12-year-old, then we have to look at the parents. I think you're right. At what point does a child begin to make some differentiated, kind of ideas about the religion they've been given versus the one they envision for themselves to have as they go forward? So I think it's a parenting issue then, possibly.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing you say, and you tell me, I think for me, for a long time, it felt like the message I was getting from other professionals is, well, you don't really have the right to challenge those ideas because you have to meet them where they're at, or you have to respect their values. And I think what I've learned from listening to you is that you can do a bit of the yes and. You can respect their values. You can be very, respectful in the process of listening to them and why these things are important to them. And you can also point out the consequences, which is different. It's different to be a therapist saying, I think you are raising your child incorrectly and in a damaging way. That would be a very direct challenge, which is not
or what I would call
appropriate.
a judgment.
Right. And it's not appropriate even within therapy practice to be direct in that way. We kind of know our ethics around that versus an invitation like, okay, so this is what I hear is important to you. And at the same time, can I share some psychoeducation with you? Or can I share some statistics about what we know about gay kids who are raised in religious homes, or some of the consequences to some of these choices as far as your parenting? Is that?
Yeah, I think where I start with these kind of conversations is I ask the client who's presenting me with these kind of intractable conflicts, how did they come up with this plan? When did you decide this was the way you were going to approach this situation? So I hold the adult first accountable that this is, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, they've made a decision to approach this life circumstance with this, what I call treatment plan. When did you come up with this treatment plan? And what are you seeing as the benefits and the downsides of this treatment plan? And usually people are coming to me in my office to talk to me about these treatment plans because they're not happy with the outcomes of the treatment plan.
Right. And I think that's I like the idea of offering responsibility and accountability to people. And at the same time, I think, especially coming from religious backgrounds, it's so easy to give that authority away. Well, it's because it's not my treatment plan. It's God's treatment plan, right? I didn't make these decisions. I'm just following God.
Well, are you happy with God's treatment plan?
Right.
If you're good with it, then what are we here? Why are you here? So, okay, we can also have conflicts with God's treatment plan. It's life.
Right. Yeah. And I think that there is benefit in having to sit back and think about that,
Yes.
Instead of just, pushing the buck over to God, I guess.
Right. Even if it is God's treatment plan, an adult has chosen to go along with it, unless God has the ability and the power to kind of, against all will, force you to follow his will. And you have no power or authority to have any differentiated response. Now, I don't know. Maybe some people feel that's the way it works. I don't know.
Yeah, I think some do. At the same time, it's complex because usually these treatment plans are coming through the mouth of men who are interpreting God's plan, right? So that's where it gets, I think, a little tricky, or I hope people would be willing to think about that anyway.
But again, I think the central narrative you're bringing here is that for some reason, the person's not happy with the way things are working. And what is their vision? This is where I like to ask, what's your vision of sexual health? Okay, here's what you're not happy with. Where are you headed? What's the vision for you?
Right. Okay.
Not so much mine.
So before I move past this then, as far as the central question of how therapists deal with what we might consider as far as standard best practice, when people come in with sexual stories that go against sexual best practice, what would you say as far as my thoughts on how we intervene?
I like to use my personal experience as a therapist before I insert the authority of research. I might say something like, well, I've been doing this for quite a few years, and the solution you're proposing is one I've never seen work before. Now, you could be the first. It's okay. There's always firsts. But, the particular solution you're proposing to me, I've not ever seen work. And so, help me understand how you think it's going to work, because I've never seen it. I have a small office and I only see a few people. So I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but in this office, what you're proposing, I've not seen work.
Yeah, that's a great one. I
just own it as my experience rather than pull in the authority of research first.
What's your thinking about that? Why is one better than the other? Or why would you go with one?
Because therapy is ultimately a relationship between people.
Mm-hmm.
And the relationship between therapist and client has been shown to be such an important healing vehicle. So if I bring like a triangulation and bring the authority of a researcher into the room, much like the client's bringing the authority of the church, we're not meeting together, just the two of us.
I like that. Yeah.
I'm interested in meeting with the person in the room. And so what I'm this therapist who sat in this office and had these conversations with people so I can authentically represent my experience. And the client is authentically representing theirs. So let's meet there first.
Yeah, I like that. So it's less clinical, less cold. There's something warmer about the process. Not that you're saying don't ever bring up research, but
right.
Not
start there. Let's start with our relationship first.
Yeah. No, I like that.
And who you've hired as a therapist, and this is who I am, and this is my experience. So let's be transparent and honest. This is who you got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did that whole thing of that. I haven't seen that work just a few weeks ago. I'm not going to share with what situation because it'll probably be too obvious who it was.
Yeah, right. No, confidentiality is good.
Yes.
When you're a podcaster,
right?
And you have clients,
and you have clients.
Right.
That's funny that you say that because I said that and I remember kind of chuckling at myself, and I think it was funny. I think I said it in a funny way.
Yeah, right. Well, and it can be delivered that way. It can be important too because there's an irony to it.
Yeah.
When human beings like to challenge what I call the laws of physics, we need humor.
That's right. Okay, good. All right. So let's move on then to some of what I think are very common, maybe complaints that I get that just present. And I think the conversation again will be similar, but it's nice to just kind of visualize this actual problem and then have a similar conversation around it. Mm-hmm. The one that I get that's very common is the sexless marriage, where one person is not having the frequency of sex that they'd like. And more than that, I mean, really it qualifies as a sexless marriage, which I think the current understanding of that is like having sex maybe less than 10 times a year around that frequency. And one person's perfectly comfortable with that scenario and arrangement, and one person isn't. Or the only reason why maybe one person is not comfortable with that scenario is because the other person's complaining about it on a regular basis. So, but in other words, one person doesn't have really the desire to have more sex. And let's say that other than that, their relationship is fairly okay. They parent well together. They enjoy maybe traveling together. They have some shared hobbies or interests. They get along fairly well. They consider themselves friends. But here's, so the rest of the relationship isn't so dire that the motivation for severing, like you said, is not high. I don't want to necessarily divorce. So oftentimes I'll see several scenarios from this dilemma. One is that the high libido partner just sells himself short, and sometimes dramatically so, because again, if your idea of the religion is you can't even masturbate or have any solo type of sex, they just become sexless themselves, even though it's not there.
Well, what I call become sexless, if solo sex is not on the map, is they retreat to the world of nocturnal emissions.
Okay, there you go.
Eventually, the body will release sperm and semen. It has to. It keeps producing it, and there will be nocturnal emissions, and people will have an emission during sleep. And that is their sex life.
Right. And I've seen that in women as well, where they'll have orgasms in their sleep, or they'll have fantasy dreams that they feel like, they don't have a lot of control over, and even wonder if they're doing something wrong by having some of those dreams.
So their sex life is in their dream state.
Right.
And nowhere else.
Right. So I'm going to tangent really quickly because there was a little pamphlet given out to the young men back in the 70s by a church leader of ours, where he called, your body the little factory, produce sperm, and you didn't have to masturbate and you didn't have to have sex because this is what would happen. You'd have nocturnal emissions. So this whole idea that masturbation is healthy or that, you'd want to have sexual release, there's no need for that. So I just say that because as you said that, I'm like, oh no, now there's going to be people who are like, see, that was right all along, even though we kind of have poo-poo.
Well, here we have
that pamphlet isn't in rotation anymore is what I want to say.
Right. What underlies the assumption in that argument is that the development of understanding one's body and its ability for pleasure is not completely out of that solution.
Right.
As if the only solution is the elimination of body fluid instead of the pleasure component of sexual health, which is the body is designed for pleasure.
Yeah.
And what do we do with that?
No, I agree. I just want to mention that because I don't want to give the wrong impression that somehow Packer was correct.
Right. And this is what I love about our conversation, because you have all that history. I just say these things and you're like going, well, wait a minute.
I'm like, oh no.
History. Yeah, right. So that's what I really enjoy about our conversation. I would never have any knowledge of that.
Right. Okay. So so they either will not masturbate or they will masturbate and even maybe look at sexually explicit materials, but then in secret, because that's not considered okay, or they feel like their spouse would be.
So they can't be honest. They can't be honest about
it. So now the honesty principle is, is there. They may not be able to be honest about their own desire. They might even be not even saying that, hey, I'm not happy with the frequency of our sex life. So honesty kind of plays a big role in all of this. And then to the point where some people even go further than that, right? Have an affair or some type of other relationship, whether that's physical or emotional or even through chatting or sexting, the many ways that people connect these days. So that's a very typical kind of scenarios, the sexless marriage, stemming from libido differences or desire discrepancies mixed in with a lot of ideas about sex in general, that sex usually in our religion, although important, is not as important as the relationship.
Yeah.
Right. And because that would be you being worldly or giving into the natural man. So it kind of sets up this scenario for a lot of anguish for both partners, or sometimes one partner doesn't know that there should be anguish involved because they just don't know. They're not in the know of what's going on.
So one of the ways I think about hearing, I'm sort of listening to my mind as I'm listening to you describe the scenario, and I keep coming back to the word pleasure. And that in a sexless marriage, I think one of the things the couple and each individual in the couple has to think about is, where do they stand with the sexual health principle of pleasure? Where is that in their vision of sexual health? What are the current sources of pleasure? Are they satisfied with the sources of pleasure they're having in life? So rather than talking about frequency of sex or sexual relations or activity, I find it kind of creates a different kind of conversation when it's about the principle of pleasure, and that there might be differences in how each values pleasure, how much wanting pleasure from each other or with themselves. And these may be changes over time, but this avoidance of a conversation about pleasure and sources of pleasure is sort of another narrative for couples to sit in and be contemplative about. Because often in that, notice if you look at the whole way you've described that situation to me, the word pleasure wasn't mentioned. And yet I think that's a significant sexual health principle that's embedded in that entire story.
Yeah, and I think the challenge there for many is, and I don't even think this is a Mormon problem, I think this is a puritanical problem, that we don't prioritize pleasure. Pleasure is kind of a secondary, it's not as important, right? I mean, you think about the work ethic of the typical American, for example, it's not as important. Like, sure, if we get to that, great, but we can't prioritize our life around that, because that would be silly almost, or superfluous, or some type of values that we have around pleasure being not as important. And maybe this is where I think some people just struggle with sex being important. The whole idea of having sexual principles, sexual health principles is like, well, but that's fine if you like sex, but If you don't, it's not that important.
I wish the listeners could see you because we're talking on camera to each other. Your body and your hand motions and your shoulder, it's all dismissiveness. All of your nonverbal communication, we're talking was what I'm really hearing you say is when people are faced with these conflicts around pleasure based on cultural norms in American society, which is beyond even one's religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they combine in this culture, in this country, a solution to these dilemmas is to be dismissive, to go to the attachment style of a dismissive response in a relationship. And the dismissive response is one of not anxiety. They just avoid. So if you listen to the tone of your voice and the way you describe these kind of solutions people have, they're not pained, they're not anguished, they're not anxious. It's just like, yeah, and so that's the avoidant response without anxiety. I think some of the clients you're describing, that avoidant response is starting to be a little more anxiety producing. And dismissiveness isn't working so well.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're sort of having to kind of maybe try to figure out what to do in the therapy office when these dismissive kind of styles are no longer an acceptable solution.
Right. All right. Next scenario that I'll put on the table is one maybe more where there's a dynamic of oppression. So, for example, very typically in our culture, women have stayed home to raise children, have not necessarily developed their own careers or ability to, take care of themselves financially if needed. And now they find themselves in a situation where, it's a less than ideal relationship or marriage. So oftentimes they're telling me, like, sex isn't even my first priority. Like, that's, I'm just trying to survive, this relationship. I don't believe in divorce. I don't want to break up my family. I don't even know how I would take care of myself if I were to divorce or take care of the kids, or maybe at least being married, I have more control over whether or not he would be harmful to the kids. Whereas, if now we're having to do joint custody, I have less control. So I'm willing to, in a sense, self-sacrifice, right? So these are the things that people tell me. So when it comes to sex, I just kind of do my duty and, make sure he's happy. And as long as I can keep that up, then we're going to be okay.
And what is the client bringing to you? Is there conflict? That may be the situation. I don't know if they have a conflict.
Well, oftentimes I think the conflict is that, she's drowning in this scenario, right? So she's feeling, even though she's telling me that, as I'm challenging and going, well, do you have other options? And she's telling me no, she's still telling me that she's incredibly unhappy.
And do you have a sense of what the primary sources of unhappiness are if we were to look through the lenses of sexual health principles? Is it that she has been unable to be honest about this? And so the therapy office is the first time she can sit in a room and just be honest, not change, not do anything differently, just have one place where this part of her life is given voice.
Yes.
And listened to and respected. That may in and of itself, it's not the solution, but it's a start. She's moving towards the honesty sexual health principle, which might be, a start.
Yeah.
Or she might be using the therapy office to sort out her values. This is the solution she's come up with at this point in her life. Perhaps something shifted in her value structure where this accommodation, this solution to these myriad of conflicts and solutions that she's come up with in a very kind of, idiosyncratic, personal way, something's shifted. Can she identify what that is? What value has changed? What has shifted? Can she give that voice? Can she identify the value that might be different? And now that that value is different, does she see herself going back to the way it was? Or does she now have to configure her life that this new value is kind of now set? And this is kind of who she's going to be going forward. So now which parts of her treatment plan have to be reconfigured? Because this value is now a permanent part of how she understands herself to be. And therapy can be a place to sort all of this out. Meanwhile, the entire life circumstance you've described hasn't changed.
Right.
So the therapist has to, I think, be careful about what I call premature movement to action, or, hearing these stories, might think that we have to move to other solutions other than those might be early alignment with certain principles of sexual health, even though she may be unaligned with others, like her pleasure is certainly not at all on the landscape, and that may come later.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think that's what my hope in having this discussion with you is, just to point out to people that your particular situations, like, I guess I want to just normalize this idea that you may be prioritizing one principle over another for good reasons, right? And that
Yes.
it may not be completely realistic today to have all of these principles aligned, in your life, or to feel that they're all having equal say in your life.
Yeah.
And that you may want to move in that direction, or you may not even. Maybe there are people who are like, I'm perfectly, I had, well, actually, I've had several gentlemen, for example, in the scenario of kind of the prior example where, they're in their 70s and they've been in a sexless marriage for 25 years and they love their wife, and they're like, there's no way I'm going to leave her.
Mhm.
She has nothing without me financially. We love each other. We've got grandchildren together.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm seeing an escort on the side, right? Or I'm masturbating and looking at porn on the side, and they have really zero desire to shift that. That just kind of comes, it's not the reason why they're coming to see me. It
Right.
comes up in our conversation,
Right.
but it's not the reason why. They're not wanting to change that. They're there for other reasons. So I just want to, and
But it
again,
might
I
be
don't want to
interesting.
say
But
that's wrong or right. I just want to say
yes.
that's how they've negotiated these types of values and principles.
And one of the things that might be interesting if a client were to do that with me is I might pause for a minute and say, how many people have you ever told that to? As a matter of factly as you told me. And was there something you were wanting from me in telling me that? Or was there something you were sort of had thought maybe you were concerned might happen if you told me that? That I find that that's the honesty sexual health principle. So sometimes just slowing down and acknowledging that somebody's moved into that space of honesty, whether it's a conflict or not, and in this case, it would not be a conflict, but nonetheless, he has moved to a more honest kind of relationship with you around an aspect of his sexual health. And in some ways, what he seems to be saying to the therapist is, my relationship with my pleasure is still there, even though it's not in this marriage. And here's the solution I've come up with. And I'm not conflicted with it.
Right.
And
Right.
what's that like to represent that in psychotherapy?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's difficult because a lot of times our values as a society or our values as a therapist might, be like, well, we believe in the value of honesty in relationships, right? Or we believe in the value of, so this is where you get a lot of different, even therapist styles and,
But what I hear in
yeah.
that statement, I believe in the value of honesty. I think there's actually something being hidden in that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they believe in the value of honesty, but that person who's saying that has a threshold that they believe the honesty value has been met. And the client is under that threshold, however the therapist defines it.
Right.
And in some therapy circles, there's almost a fetishizing of absolute complete honesty as the only acceptable threshold. And then other psychotherapy disciplines or other psychotherapists may have different thresholds of what is this threshold of honesty, minimum honesty to meet the sexual health principle. Whereas I'm a bit more client-centered. Is this a sufficient level of honesty for you in how you live your life?
Right.
And they chose to be honest with me. How did you choose to do that? Why did you want that to be honest here? And yet in other relationships, you don't. You're evidently doing some algorithm here, and I'm curious about what your algorithm is. So it's the client's threshold for honesty and the consequences of what that threshold of honesty is that I think is an important psychotherapy conversation, rather than the therapist having a level of honesty that the client has to arbitrarily align with.
Right. Which is what we see a lot with the issues I see come up with, for example, sex addiction treatments or infidelity treatments, where, as part of the treatment protocol, the person who has betrayed the spouse or the betrayer, however you want to language that.
The one who hasn't kept the agreement.
The one who hasn't kept the agreement is, kind of told by the therapist oftentimes that they have to come clean, that there has to be this huge disclosure, and that disclosure is usually very detailed. And so now there's a lot more, again, room or potential for secret keeping again, because that's typically the story I get, later down the road, is that first disclosure wasn't a complete disclosure the way that maybe the person who thought they were getting disclosed to, so it just opens up a lot of, I think, variabilities. And I guess the reason why I think it's important to talk about this is that people know that depending on who you go to do therapy with, you might get a very different approach to some of these
So
principles.
I would encourage anybody who sees a therapist who states in a very absolute, certain, confident, fairly set manner in which honesty and levels of honesty are to occur in therapy for there to be any hope for change. It might be interesting for the client to say, how did you decide that this was the route forward for all clients? Because I think the dilemma I have with these kinds of strategies or trainings is that they tend to be broad brushed and seem to be putting the therapist in the position of applying this strategy in all circumstances. And I think that's the danger.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That I think there are too many individual circumstances that need to be considered before a broad brushed kind of general approach is sort of placed upon the couple. And I think now let's deal with the exploitive dimension of sexual health.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an exploitive dimension to this on the part of therapy. These are people who are scared, who are hurt, who are terrified of losing their marriage, people who have been discovered of not keeping the agreement, and the power dynamics have shifted so, just tremendously overnight because of the disclosure. And oftentimes somebody wanting to stay in the marriage will not see themselves as having any agency or power at all. And that the injured party, the party that thought the agreement was being kept, that had been exploited for years, now, wants to regain the power. And so when they enter into therapy, and the therapist also has this powerful position of saying, here's the way it works, here's what you need to do, here, this is the way to have hope. There's also an exploitive dimension possibility of that the client isn't really being given enough time to contemplate some of the consequences of these very influential interventions that can resonate for the rest of the life of a marriage, forever.
Mm-hmm.
These are not benign interventions. Before you go and do surgery, you tell people what all the consequences of the surgery could be.
Right.
And I don't know if I see therapists taking enough responsibility for slowing things down, because oftentimes I think therapists and everybody believes that they're in the middle of a sex emergency. And there's no such thing as a sex emergency. They don't exist. People are scared. That's true. People are terrified. People are hurt. People are angry. People are enraged. But that's not a sex emergency. We have to kind of be careful about when we move in a very authoritarian position to assert some sort of threshold of honesty that's a very high standard that is done very early in the clinical relationship. And this is often the case in inpatient treatment programs.
Yes. No, I'm fully aware. What would you say are, people might say, well, what's wrong with honesty? What's wrong with information? What's wrong with, what could possibly go wrong with disclosure of information?
Well, there's 5 other sexual health principles.
Yeah.
Honesty's not standing out there all by itself without any other interlink to other sexual health principles.
That's right. Yeah.
What is the consequence of this honesty for the future of pleasure in this couple? What values might be met or not met by this full transparency?
Right.
What dimensions of exploitation could possibly be, occurring?
Yeah, and especially the pleasure one, that's when I talk with couples oftentimes in infidelity. Do you really want all this information swimming around in your head, 10 years from now, when you're, past this initial hurt and really wanting to connect? It's sometimes not useful to have every single detail. Plus, there's privacy principles too. So,
and there's some research to support this, that the erotic life that's sustained over the course of a relationship needs to have some mystery.
Mm-hmm.
You have to reach across the other in some space of mystery.
Yeah.
And in the name of treatment for sex addiction, what's happening to the erotic potential and life of the partners going forward? And how is that taken into consideration? It's like prostate surgery for prostate cancer. They used to not really be on the up and up with men about the consequences for sexual functioning before the surgery because they were so paranoid and scared of the cancer. And they're getting better about saying, well, look, here's what could happen. And some men go, okay, I'm going to watch this for a while. I'm not going to run right into surgery. So people it's a collaborative exchange rather than a top-down kind of potentially exploitive situation because people are terrified.
Talk a little bit about how it can become exploitative in this situation that we're talking about with infidelity, as far as wanting information from an honest perspective.
That the therapist doesn't slow everybody down. and have the responsibility of seeing the power dynamics in the couple. A very human response to this kind of betrayal is to want to reclaim as much power back as possible. That's human, that's very real, but that's temporary. It's, this is not the way if the couple's going to go on in the future and endure, this current power shift is not permanent. It's a response to pain. And so we have to think, the therapist has to be thinking a little bit more long-term for the couple, much like a physician would have to think more long-term for the patient around the particular interventions and treatment that they're proposing. And so I think the therapist has a responsibility to slow things down, educate clients what they're really looking at and what the pros and cons of this particular intervention may be. And I don't see that being proposed in the full disclosure approach. What I often hear is that any ambivalence about full disclosure is seen as loss of hope for the treatment outcome.
Yeah. And I guess I would even say that sometimes it can become exploitative from the injured party. In other words, not that they're meaning to be exploitative, but because like you're saying, it's coming from this place of hurt. But when it's like, this other person now has zero power, I hold all the power. If I don't get the information or if I don't get you to act the way I want you to act, then, here's this consequence of me laying down the hatchet on the relationship. So there's some potential.
The severing response will be used
as
a threat to assert the power to get as much information as they want.
And that can be a really hard thing to hear if you're already injured. And now on top of it, you're being kind of cautioned about that type of thing. So that's really hard. All right. The last scenario I'd like to kind of put on the table, and then of course, I'm open to your ideas too, as far as what maybe I'm not bringing to the table, is the LGBT community, right? So this is oftentimes in many, many religions, obviously, there's the issue of the values. And again, I know we've talked about this in the past, but it's so incredibly, I guess, insidious to me, right? So it feels so difficult to me to be able to honor the values where this comes from, because I feel like it's just so damaging to the people who are having to negotiate these values. So I tend to get angry at the system, right? And I know you're going to pull me back to the individual, which is good.
You're catching on to my one-trick pony here, Natasha.
But again, the most common scenarios I see are this is a very typical kind of storyline. So a youth will come in, somewhere between the ages of 12 and 19 and start discussing that this is even an issue for them. And there's oftentimes been something ahead of that to, either grades are dropping, they're cutting themselves, they're suicidal, they're, having panic attacks. Typically the presentation that I've seen is that they're high achievers. They're the types that are like doing everything right to try to somehow tie into that equation that if I do everything right, this will go away, right? So God will bless me and take this away from me if I do everything right. So they're high achievers. They're usually very involved in the church community and they have a sincere testimony, right? So they believe these things. Mm-hmm. So that's a very typical.
In fact, they may need to believe them more than other people.
Yeah. I mean, they believe it.
There's high stakes here. So
there's high stakes.
They're heavily invested in
heavily
this.
Invested.
Heavily invested because the outcome is essential.
Yes. And then, again, the typical person who shows up in my office, there may be plenty of people who never show up to the office. And so they just, they go about it a different way. But somewhere between, their early 20s and their 40s, something happens where the status quo doesn't work anymore. Now, by this point, they might be in a mixed orientation marriage. They may have gone on a mission. They may be trying to date, or they might try the celibacy approach, right? Or they're going ahead and having same-sex relationships, but with a lot of guilt, a lot of self-loathing. So something is, they're constantly in conflict with some aspect of themselves. Mm-hmm. And usually by the age of 40, 45, what I typically see at that point is the the church approach. Like, I can't believe I've spent my entire life in this horrific kind of stance and sadness. And now I'm, super angry with the church. I'm leaving the church. I'm potentially leaving my mixed orientation marriage. I, maybe have these children now. So there's just kind of this implosion type of thing that happens, in midlife where, reclaiming themselves is really becoming a very important part of their journey.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one presentation, right? So obviously there's the people who stay in mixed orientation marriages. There's people who continue to believe, even though they don't feel like they can muster, the activity of it. There's people who still go to church and are even with their same-sex partners, even though they may experience disciplines. I mean, there's all different kinds of scenarios, but to me, it's just the story of constant turmoil, sadness.
Which I'm going to propose to you, the constant turmoil and sadness is when the solution to these dilemmas is an attempt to abide by one sexual health principle at the sacrifice of another. And that trade-off over time for some people longer is worth it. In other words, the question that I wrote here as I was listening to you is, which disappointment is the person willing to live with? And they've been willing to live with one disappointment, and maybe that equation has changed. And that disappointment is no longer tolerable for them.
Yeah, and this is why I'm so angry at the system, right? Because I feel like the system places people in this position. It's not like us straight people are in this position, right? We don't have to struggle with these positions, or wonder which principle we have to choose or align ourselves with, because we're not even placed in that position.
Well, they may not have been, maybe about not orientation, but in other ways, these conflicts.
Yes, in other ways, yes.
Yeah, but not about object, desire and who you're,
right, which of course is such an integral part of people's, identity and self. And so this is where I just feel like it's an abusive system that people are trying to navigate. So that becomes where I get more maybe provocative in my language or...
Well, again, what I would encourage you as a therapist to think about is that germane and helpful to the client, to have the therapy space be one that creates a clearer narrative about the system that they've been living within and the consequences of aligning themselves with that system. And perhaps for whatever reason, that's now less tenable for them and how painful that is. And I particularly, you said, not everybody comes to therapy for these moments. So I think it might be interesting for the therapist to think about, what is this sub-cohort of people? What do they have in common that they seek out therapy at this time in life where other people don't? What makes them different? Why are they coming to a psychotherapist as a part of this stage of life conflict? I don't know the answer to that one, but it's kind of interesting, isn't it? That, that got my attention. Well, not everybody goes to a therapist for this, but the people who do, why are they coming to a therapist and going someplace else?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and unfortunately, I think sometimes, especially at first, as adolescents or as parents of adolescents, they're coming because they want you to somehow cure this or change this, to figure out a way where, you don't have to be gay or lesbian or transgender or bi or any of those things.
So the mental health field has been complicit for years, the mental health field, to some degree, just by the fact that it didn't refute it, promoted the idea that they could perform eroticectomies through psychotherapy. And that false promise remains as a hope for some people. And that's on the mental health field. They promoted this idea.
Which leads me full circle to the first question I asked, which is, when does a therapist say that's not going to work versus, sure, I'll meet you where you're at and let's work on a goal that is against best standard
Well,
practice?
I guess it would be the same thing as if you're working with a psychotic patient. When do you help a client have a reality check? Get them grounded in reality. And I think there's a responsibility as a therapist to not let a client sit with delusional thinking in front of you and not address the fact that there's delusional thinking in the room or paranoid thinking. Or,
okay, so would you agree that that's a struggle when it comes to religious values? Because calling a religious value delusional thinking...
No, the religious value is not the delusional thinking. The idea that there's solution to that religious value conflict, that's the delusion. That I, as a therapist, can provide you this particular outcome because of your religious values. That's the delusional thinking. That their religious value can be whatever it wants to be. I'm not here to discuss that. I'm here to discuss what they're wanting from me, not from their religion. What they're wanting from me is to resolve their conflict with their religion by changing their sexual orientation, or at least resolving the desire and intensity of it enough that they're no longer in pain over it.
Yeah, and the reason I'm kind of pushing back is it's just I can hear the voice, I can hear the pushbacks that I get on the other side of the couch, right? So in other words, if I was to say, that's not something I can help you with, there's still, I guess what I mean by the delusional thinking is that if your belief is that God can cure this, quote, you cannot see my quote unquote signs that I'm throwing all over the place. And you come to a therapist who says, well, that doesn't work.
Well, I might say God can't do it through me. I don't know where God does it, but not in this room.
Right, not in this room. They may, of course, then fire you, which is fine. People can fire their therapists, and they'll go find a therapist who, in my position, is unethically willing to promise that or to offer that type of solution when we don't have the research to back that up or evidence.
Right. Every healthcare system has its charlatans. People go to doctors who provide all sorts of false promises. The mental health field is not immune from this.
Oh, no, not at all.
And some people go to them for hope, particularly when they're desperate. I mean, this is not new. This is not a new story. I think it's just hard for us as mental health professionals to realize we have colleagues who engage in this and make money from it. It's painful. So when I've had people in this situation, the one thing I have said is I have informed them of what the research shows. This is where I will assert research and said, you can certainly go for sexual reorientation therapy, or you can invest in these programs that therapists offer. You can do that. And if it's in California, I say, by the way, that's against the law for that to be provided in California. So you might have to go to another state.
Isn't it just for a minor though? Or is it also for adults in California?
I don't know.
I think it's only for minors.
Okay. It might be only for minors. I don't know this. I don't know the law, but I think what's important here is just to sort of let people know that the research shows this actually has enormous health consequences that harm people even more. And that I have a responsibility to let you know that the procedure you're interested in going through, the research shows harms people. You can still do it. You're an adult. You can do whatever you want. But I don't feel ethically good in our relationship having you leave this room and not tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah. Which again, those kinds of things seem to come up for me with things like the sexual addiction model, sexual shame in general, through religious lenses. This is where it just gets very complicated because I'm not wanting to go against people's values. And yet we see over and over again the harm that comes from some of the ways that people interpret their religion or sexuality through their religion. And so that's the constant area of tension and why this whole, conversation with you has been so useful because it gives some framing on how to challenge some of those ideas or at least invite conversation or dialogue or inner critical thinking through some of these principles as we struggle to, be aligned with our religion or our faith, if that's something that's important to us, and at the same time also be aligned with health and sexuality and things that are important in that realm as well.
And I really appreciate you talking about the amount of pain you sit with when people are in dire conflict with both of these desires, and you really sit with people in this space far more than I do. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why I need to do my own work on anger management.
Right. I mean, why? I mean, I think to have some compassion with yourself is that you're asking yourself to sit in a space with humanity that's a space even our own country doesn't know how to do for the most part. You're really trying to do something that is really hard for most people to figure out how to do.
Yeah, well, I so appreciate your willingness to have these conversations with me. It's been very personally helpful. And I think also, I hope, will be helpful to many as they're trying to navigate these either inner dialogues or relational dialogues with the people that matter to them.
Yeah, it's been interesting today how the more we've gotten into the details, the more you've invited us into, a world of pain.
It is painful when I see people, as you were talking about pain, I can see several of, for instance, a lesbian couple, a gay couple, like sobbing on my couch, just facing excommunication for their choice to get married, facing family, expulsion due to the coming out process. And when that is done in the name of my God, that is, something I struggle with.
Yeah.
So,
You have a different position than I do as a therapist in those moments.
Yeah.
Because of who you are and how you live your life and where you come from.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this experience.
It's been an honor for me too. I can't tell you how happy I am when I get to tell people, when they ask me about religion and sexual health, I said, well, I've been doing a podcast series with a Mormon therapist, and we've been talking about the principles, and they relate to the Mormon religion. And people are just, so curious about this.
Yes. Well, I hope, even though we've focused so much on Mormonism, I think there's a lot of common denominators here, to a lot of other, either evangelical faiths or Catholicism or more Orthodox Judaism. I mean, obviously there's differences, but a lot of the principles of how we deal with religious values in general, and then these sexual principles, I think, there can be a lot of common denominators there for sure.
Yeah.
Well, just so you know, you have an open invitation to this podcast.
How lovely.
And if you ever feel like, this is something we could have talked about, or if you come across anything, please reach out to me. And I, of course, will do the same. You're welcome to reject me at any point. That's fine. But I have found this to be incredibly valuable. So thank you so much for your time, your willingness. I know that your time is very valuable, and you're all over the place, and you're very wanted these days. You're very desired. So the fact that you'd spend time with us is very meaningful to me. So thank you.
You're more than welcome.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go. All wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary love.
Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to a co-production between Mormon Sex Info and Mormon Mental Health. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and we are here to do our monthly Mormon Sex in the News, which is, I think, usually a more upbeat topic than I think it will be tonight. But there's been a lot of hoopla in the Mormon world in regards to a lot of really concerning issues. And so we're going to be discussing those at length tonight. Before I get going, for those of you who are subscribers to Mormon Sex Info, thank you so much. And please spread the word and know that you get these episodes about a week or two advanced of Mormon Mental Health. So that's a little benefit that you get. And for those of you who are Mormon Mental Health listeners, you know that I'm asking for donations. Lots of you have stepped up to the plate. There's been a couple of really pretty large donors. I can't thank you enough for that. We need every little bit we can get to keep this podcast going and this being a resource for all of you. So I hope that you'll consider, if you find value in these episodes that I do, to hit the donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. On the right-hand side, there's a very easy little button there that you can hit. And any little bit will do and will be very helpful. So thank you for all of those who are doing that so far. Tonight, I have with me Kristin Marie Bennion. She's been on the show before, as well as Amy Heffernan. Kristin Marie Bennion is a certified sex therapist, and she'll introduce herself a little bit more. Amy Heffernan is, did you get your certification yet, or is it still in?
Just waiting to hear back. So.
All right. We've
Fingers
submitted
crossed.
everything. We've submitted everything, right? So it takes a few weeks to get that all to go through, but you're almost there. So it's a process that takes anywhere from 18 months to about 3 to 4 years, depending on how people go about that. It's a very in-depth look into human sexuality, and why I make sure that only those who've gone through that process are invited to come onto this show. So thanks so much for being with me tonight. Can you each just introduce yourself a little bit further? Kristin, why don't we start with you, and then Amy?
Sure. Like Natasha said, my name is Kristin Marie Bennion. I have a clinical practice in Orem, Utah, where I work full-time primarily with LDS clients in the intersection of faith and sexuality. I've been in practice I've been a therapist for about 8 or 9 years. Got my certification, like Natasha was saying, and it was just history from there. I'm also working toward a doctoral degree in sexuality studies right now. So that keeps me pretty busy.
For sure. Thank you. Amy?
Yes, I'm a marriage and family therapist in Redmond, Washington, which is like Microsoft land. And I've been in private practice for about 9 years. And like Natasha said, I'm almost certified, crossing my fingers that everything goes through.
Great. Thank you. And we are all members of the Mormon Mental Health Association, which means that we've all been vetted as far as being culturally competent to work with Mormons. I think all 3 of us were at least born and raised in the church. And so anyway, so we all have pretty good insight in regards to that, to our culture and things of that nature as well, and can speak to these issues. All right, I'm going to try really, really hard to be quiet for the most part tonight because I feel like all of the different issues that we've talked about, I've already said a lot on previous podcasts or writings on my blog, et cetera, and I really want to hear from the both of you. But we're going to start off with, this huge thing that happened about 2.5, 3 weeks now ago with Mormon Leaks, where, a prior sister missionary went ahead and interviewed Joseph L. Bishop, who was the MTC president at the time. And she did an interview with him, and that interview was leaked by this organization called Mormon Leaks. And in that interview, it's very distressing to hear, the accusations that she has against him of sexual assault. And he, pretty much agrees that he was involved in behavior that was completely violated her and also potentially other women. So he can't even remember which woman she is because he's kind of done these things to other people. So the whole thing is pretty horrific to listen to. So we've seen kind of the Mormon world respond to that. And I would just like to get both of your thoughts as far as, how has the church responded? How has church membership responded? How has this woman responded? Let's just kind of try to hit some of the things that you're thinking of as you see this story unfold.
Well, I think initially the church came out with a press release that left room for, what's the word? Yeah, it was a disappointment to me reading that first initial press release that they came out with.
Well, I think you meaning room for character and assassination of the woman who was making.
Yeah, there was some subtle things that I think if you're like in the tribe that you when you read that, it was very clearly a demeaning of her, saying she's a former member. She only went on a mission for a short time. It was kind of this like subtle kind of discounting her as being a person of importance into the internal tribe, right? Mm-hmm. It was kind of outsiding her,
like a delegitimizing her.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was really disappointed with their response in the wake of this Me Too movement, and seeing how different companies have responded to different celebrities and like them canceling shows and completely firing people. Even Matt Lauer, like that was a big one where they're just like, he's done, and he's pretty much the biggest, news anchor there. And I was hoping for better, for them to follow the lead of kind of what we've been seeing as this trend of really positive movement in that direction. So my initial response was one of disappointment.
Kristin?
Absolutely the same to me. And I thought it was really, I think hindsight is just always a bit fascinating, but it was only, I think, 3 days later that a different statement was released, right? Where there was different language, definitely different language used, and it was much more softened. And I think that was just the beginning of what became kind of the tidal wave of back, kind of felt like backpedaling, honestly, quite a bit. Yeah, and I know my practice, it was like wildfire. From people like incredibly strong believers to those who have left. I mean, it was just rocking many people in my practice that week.
Meaning they were coming in and talking to you about these things.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Deeply troubled by it.
Yeah. I had a lot of people bring it up in session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as did I. And I agree that the first response from the church was really pretty horrific. It took no responsibility. There was no apology. It definitely casted her in a negative light, kind of like, well, we'll see if these accusations even come to pass, even though he had admitted to it on the tape. Mm-hmm. And
it put accountability on the judicial system versus saying we're also going to do our own independent, looking into this situation in this case. Like they wouldn't have even had to say, yes, it happened, or no, it didn't happen. They could have just said, wow, this is an alarming report. We wouldn't never want any member to ever feel that there was sexual abuse from a leader in this position. We're going to look into it.
Right.
That would have been a satisfactory answer for me, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they didn't do that. And it like almost breaks my heart in some ways, just like, oh, is this what we're going to do? We're going to continue to protect the institution at all costs over individuals. Mm-hmm. And that is what really gets me sad, Mm-hmm. At what point is that going to shift, or is it ever?
Absolutely.
Well, and so what happens, I think, is that the story becomes a lot bigger than this particular character, correct? So at first it's just kind of like, wow, how could this, FCC president have done this thing? But then all of a sudden when the church responds the way it did, it becomes a much larger systemic issue, which is where you start getting the hundreds, if not thousands of stories that I've seen, just on social media, comment threads, different groups, different blog post comments, where women are talking about how this is not uncommon for them to have had a similar experience of talking to ecclesiastical leaders about abuses that have happened and then nothing really being done to the perpetrators.
Well, and I think what goes kind of without saying, but I guess I'll say it, is as with any institution, it's oftentimes not necessarily the crime as horrific as it is, but the cover up that just kept unfolding of how many times she had reported it and how many people disregarded her because of their own either biases or how she was coming off across to them, which obviously was seen through their own lens. And for decades, this had been happening. And that is incredibly disturbing. And that, I think, is what's coming up for me when you say it becomes bigger than the characters that we're talking about right now, the people in the news right now. It goes to how many people are raising their hands going, I have a similar story. It might not be the exact same thing, but no wonder nothing ever happened to so-and-so, or no wonder I kept seeing that person in sacrament meeting, and it seemed like nothing was happening because probably nothing is what is kind of coming to light for a lot of people right now, I think.
Well, it's so interesting, I think, too, to think, we're so careful to not, I think, the obvious concern is, well, we don't want to punish somebody if there isn't evidence, or, it's he said, she said, or how are we supposed to really know, which was kind of the legal arguments they were making. And yet they make all kinds of judgment calls on who's dangerous or not dangerous without any legal help on gay people being excommunicated, thought policing, as far as people who might be more feminist or intellectual or have doubts, and all of a sudden they can't, teach in Sunday school.
Right.
I'm one of those people, right? That's been demoted. I've been demoted in my ward as far as who I'm allowed to teach. And so I don't know why. There's nobody making a legal case against me in order to be able to demote me in that way. So you have thoughts as to why it's so hard when it comes to this particular problem of sexual assault versus other problems that we're very quick to make judgments on?
So I think it has more to do with status than anything else. So the status of this individual is, high status. He's an MTC president, right? When he was, and so that has bigger consequences versus, not that, Natasha, you have lots of status in my eyes, but you know what I mean? Like it's not like your position of power.
I'm no MTC
where you've been,
right?
Yeah. And so I think that, I think that has a lot to do with protect people, because there's bigger consequences for what that means, and this is not just like a Mormon church issue. This is like many systems and many institutions. You look at the history with the Catholic Church around sexual abuse stuff, right? And it's people of power that are doing the abuse, and it's more, there's more of a embarrassment to when they have a higher status. And so I think that the implications of that person doing something that looks as evil or abusive has more consequences to the bigger church. So there's more likelihood that that's going to be, protected and defended, because it makes the church look worse, right? So I think status has a big part in this story.
Yeah.
I want to just double on, or go a little bit further to what you're saying, and speak to her status, just the other side. I'm just completely agreeing with you. And what is so, I think, egregious about this situation is it's no more egregious than any other abuse of power or sexual assault in any way. But what is so just clear with this situation, is that it makes it so clear that the power differential and the abuse that can happen within any hierarchy. Specifically, this is a patriarchy, where when she was that age, she was already in such a vulnerable position, and going to a place where she was told for years that she would be completely safe, and just 100% taken advantage of. And he was on the fast track to general authority. And so that is just, I think, what is so fascinating and tragic about this story is it just uncovers the clear problems that people like us are always incredibly concerned to hear about.
Yeah. Well, and now she's come forward just this last week that she's going to be officially starting a lawsuit against the church publicly, right? So a lot of times these lawsuits happen, but nobody really knows about them. And then there's non-disclosure agreements and settlements. And any thoughts that the two of you have as far as non-disclosure agreements when it comes to these types of issues from the regards of mental health?
Well, my first thought that went through my mind is I'm not a fan right now. And I think that there are some things that can, I'm sure, be fine, but so often they are used to silence people and make them, the problem, quote unquote, go away. And so then it's incredibly difficult for someone to advocate for themselves or talk about their story, and especially with a history of assault. Often, as we know, telling one story can be incredibly healing, and so that really can be problematic. But that was just my first thought. I'm sure there's tons of other avenues.
Yeah, I think silence is the word there. I picture like a non-disclosure, like a big giant piece of duct tape on someone's mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
Just this, like, you can't speak, you can't talk, like this is secret. Right. And I just always say, like, secrets keep you sick. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so systemically, when you do this, it keeps the system sick. Right. And I want help for our Mormon system. I care about the tribe so deeply. And it's like, I want it to be healthy. I don't want it to look like this. Right. And so I think that some of that stuff is like, it just continues to silence stories. And it doesn't mean that, like, I don't think all church leaders are bad. I really genuinely think most of the church leaders that have been in my life are good people, right? But there are people that do abuse the power that they have in those status positions. We know that. We hear stories like that, right? And I think with everything, the more we talk about things, the less likely things will happen. I hope that's what you hope for, to say, how do we open this up and smash it open so that people can see the underbelly of what abuse of power can look like. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those, like, non-disclosure statements are just this big piece of duct tape on people's mouth that just continue to make a broken system. Right. Mm-hmm. And I want the best. I want the best for this system. Truly, I'm rooting for it. Right. It's not that I'm like, I want it to be healthy. And this kind of stuff is not healthy for anyone.
Yeah. That's the piece. I mean, I can understand from a legal perspective or a business perspective, anybody can say, well, they're just part of normal legal proceedings and et cetera. But I guess I just don't expect a church to be part of normal legal proceedings. I expect it to have its first priority be ministry. Mm-hmm. And so when you're thinking about sexual trauma and ministering to victims and survivors, silencing their stories is the exact opposite of what we would want to do. And there's really, I don't understand the need for it. I think it'd be so much more healthy for the system to be like, well, we're going to do everything possible to try to keep any type of sexual trauma from happening in our community and within our chapels and, ward houses. And at the same time, every community deals with sexual predators. And so when these stories come up, it's like, well, we're going to help you, we're going to provide resources. We're going to let you tell your story. We're going to have financial kind of monies backing your healing, and we're going to do everything in our power to be a support system for you. I just don't understand why it's so scary for any organization to just own the fact that this kind of stuff happens within our systems, because there's not much, although there's lots of things that you can do to do prevention. And there's been a lot of talk about how the church is also failing in that regard, but there's no need to cover it up when we know it happens, and it's much better to air everything out for everybody involved.
Yeah, I think that's why I was so surprised by the defensiveness of their response, right? Yes. I was like, did any woman look at this PR release? Like, was there any woman's eyes on this? Because it felt so defensive. And then to find out that the church lawyers then did this huge, is it called dossier? I never know how to say it right. Yeah, to be able to, like, find all of this horrible information on her and then distribute that to news organizations. And I just think,
what? Like, so even that action was shocking to me. And I don't know why maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Like maybe I'm too naive or too optimistic, but I that also was a very surprising response that they had.
And it's shocking in addition to, I think in their second release, they said that they don't have the resources for like investigation or something like that. When, and so I might miss the timeline. I can't remember when that one came out, but I mean, that was such that was just wrong in every way, shape, or form to find out. And please jump in if you know the timeline better, but to find out that, you know, when she, I think, reported, or they came to their awareness last November or something, you know, and or whenever it came out, and all of a sudden they were researching her previous discussions with bishops and her criminal history or something like that, and her adoption, like all these things that should remain confidential, were now put into this dossier that you were just talking about, Amy, and given to Bishop's lawyer. Right. So I'm putting myself in the position of someone who is reporting sexual assault and trying to wrap my mind around my church taking things that I'd talked to bishops about, and in the form of like maybe the repentance process in the past, compiling it in a list and giving it to my perpetrator's lawyer. Like that I cannot even wrap my mind around.
That was very well stated, because that's exactly right. And this is a huge breach of confidentiality. I think insidious and frankly evil, and also goes against so many. I mean, first of all, the fact that they don't have resources, this is like pretty much everybody knows that our church is one of the richest organizations in the world. So give me a break. We also know that we have incredible legal power behind our church. Nobody wants to go up against our church, legally speaking, and probably why something like this hasn't happened before at the level that it's happening now. And then the other thing that, you know, from a doctrinal perspective, you know, I remember so many ward councils I was in where, you know, the idea is we are not just here to help members. You know, we are here like the prophet, if we're really going to believe what we say, right? The prophet is the prophet of the whole world. So it shouldn't matter if you're a member in good standing or not a member or whatever, he's still your prophet, right? That's the doctrinal idea. And so to somehow categorize this like, well, she's a less active, you know, former Mormon that we can attack.
Yep.
It just doesn't even make any doctrinal sense. It's like she's still a part of the fold. And anyway, the whole thing is just totally just very, very dark. Very dark. And it's interesting to see, obviously, the members who are really struggling with this, you know, really struggling to come to terms with how their church could be doing some of these things. And then, of course, members who are doubling down with the church, right? And protecting the church and not really understanding why anybody's upset about this. So any comments as far as just the different reactions?
I am kind of appalled, but I think I think it's pretty clear where I'm standing, you know, when I sit in my office and hear client after client all along the believing spectrum report being completely disturbed. I think it's really only been online that I've seen some of these responses that to me is just willful ignorance. And I cringe saying that because I don't often find myself in that position to talk to someone that way. But this is one of those topics that is just so beyond like egregious, and the evidence is so beyond clear. And so you have to willfully be choosing to not see what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so moving on then, this all happened right at the same time that there was this, or still is, this protectldschildren.org movement, which I've been a part of as far as supporting from a professional perspective. So I'd like to, again, hear more from the two of you about this. There was a march last Friday from City Hall to the church office building. There were I was interesting because we got a count of 2,200 people, yet Deseret News and most of the media outlets said, several hundred people showed up instead of several thousand. So anyway, it's like there's a lot of movement, kind of like, Amy, you mentioned the Me Too movement. There's a lot of dialogue today around these issues of sexual assault and sexual harassment and protecting children and protecting ourselves. So this is all kind of happening at the same time. So any thoughts about that movement from either of you, or the march, or what you saw from that end?
Yeah, I'll go. I'm sure that Natasha won't talk about this, but if you haven't had a chance to hear Natasha's speech, was it the city council building? Is that where you were?
Yes.
It was unbelievably incredible speech, Natasha. Like, I was watching it and I got the chills, like tears. It was powerful. Like, truly, people need to listen to that. I don't know if you can make it available publicly or if you could link to it on this podcast somehow, but I think people need to hear that, because your passion and the things that you shared really, I think, summarized the purpose of the march and the movement in the most powerful, eloquent, articulate way. So,
wow. Well, thank
people
you.
Haven't listened to that. I think that you did such a wonderful job of like really capturing why this is important, right? So go listen to that. That's
so
my
now I'll have to link to it. So thank you.
It was really good. It should be linked to, because honestly, I think that, like, if people don't really know why it's important, I think there's a lot of people that are kind of like, why is this a big deal? Like, I like, sometimes people get it, and sometimes people are like, why are they making a fuss about this? I know I've had a couple conversations about that with kind of just, some of, people in my world. They're kind of saying, what's the big deal? So I would be uncomfortable if either of my parents were in any of the, interviews that I had with the bishop, kind of talking about things, things that I had done, and I think that sometimes we have a too deep leadership role around Cub Scouting. And even in an ideal world, primary callings, they've kind of tried to do that a little bit more, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that when, in a position that, like, therapists are in a lot, we hear lots of stories. We hear the gamut of people's experiences in Mormonism and with leadership. And I just think that there can be problems, right? And I think that bringing the issues to people's attention is a great way to kind of get your eyes a little bit open on some of the issues that happen with behind closed doors with leadership,
Right.
And so it was great to see so many people turn out for that. I was really happy, actually, to see that.
So powerful. I have nothing more to add except for I was in full support and so proud of my friend Natasha.
Oh,
and wish that I could have been there. I've been a advocate for changing the policies for bishops' interviews for a while now.
Well, and many of us in this profession have been talking about this being problematic for years. This is not a new issue, but the movement with Sam Young kind of got new energy, and, his petition and things like that kind of got more attention, but it's not a new concept. It's not a new concern. And I think people like all of us have been concerned for years about the potential risks.
And
but sorry, go ahead, Kristin.
Well, I was going to say, I did find it interesting that around the march and around everything with that in the media with this bishop character, they did release a new policy with bishops' interviews where, granting permission for someone to be able to request, like a child or a woman, those two, to be able to request to have someone there with them, which was interesting timing.
Yeah, no, they definitely did that. Although I will say that there's a lot of interesting languaging there. I mean, that parents are allowed to come. I mean, first of all, parents are always allowed. There wasn't really ever a policy saying they were not allowed. So it's interesting how they're making this big change, even though it's really not a change. It's just more of like a clarification. And then on top of it, they're putting the onus of that responsibility onto the child or vulnerable woman, or they don't even mention men, right? Because of course no men are more vulnerable in our church. And so there's a lot of interesting responsibility there that, again, the church isn't really owning. The church doesn't want to take the responsibility and say, hey, we need to make sure this is safe for everybody. Like, how's a 12-year-old kid or a 15-year-old kid going to say, oh yeah, by the way, I need to stand up for my rights and have another person in here with me? It's just kind of ridiculous. So,
I read it and I was like, obviously I'm glad that there's, I'll take a, centipede step or whatever inch step. But, my policy brain was going off going, the implementation of this is not really going to be that beneficial. Like the follow through is going to be pretty tough, as you were saying, the onus being, it's going to benefit people with either progressive parents or really assertive kids.
Yeah. And it changes the people who are believing members and more, really want to see the positives in the church, which I totally understand that. I want to see positives too and encourage that. There, like I had somebody come up to me and say, see, Natasha, you won. And I was like, oh my gosh, no, we did not win. We did not win anything like this. So it kind of puts people in a position like, see, the church is doing something about it. See, there's lots of things here that we can be happy about. And really there was no change. It really isn't a policy. It's a guidance that should have already been in place. And all it will really do is some really rigid bishops who would have said no to anybody being in an interview. Now they'll have to say yes. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess the only thing that I hope changes from it is that someone that does want to be in the interviews with their kids, it doesn't give them a stigma of like, oh, here goes crazy Sister Anderson, or what, like always just wanting to do this thing. I think what you would hope is that it allows this kind of like, oh yeah, some people do it and some people don't. Right.
Right.
Right. I guess that's my hope, that like that change and that clarification will allow so that it won't be this like that you're a nuisance if you want to do it,
exactly.
Which might have been before because there wasn't a clarification. And so I've known lots of parents who've said, I'm going to be in there when you're going to interview my kids. Right. And then it becomes this, like, they're the problem parents. Right. Do you get what I'm talking about? That energy of like,
I'm that parent, so I know. I know what that feels like.
Right. Yeah. Like we have some good friends that wanted to do that. And they always kind of had this like, oh, here they like go. They eye roll. Like a little, this like sigh of like, oh, they're causing a ripple in what is just normal protocol that we do.
Right.
So I'm hoping that the clarification kind of decreases that. That's what I'm hoping,
Yes. No, and I agree. I agree that it will hopefully at least do that. But there's I just want people to understand there's no organizational policy change that's going to be implemented. So anyway, what I do want to say about the march, just from my own personal perspective, is that, first of all the speakers were excellent. If you can listen to all of them, Katie Langston, who's actually a pastor now in the Lutheran Church. She was a member of the Mormon Mental Health Association for a bit while she was doing training as a mental health professional. And then she kind of shifted careers. And she gave a phenomenal speech. Mark Milan gave an excellent speech about clinical psychology and just really, really good work. And of course, Sam spoke and then I spoke. But what I will say about that experience is that as I'm looking out at the audience because I'm the last speaker. So I'm looking at the audience as everybody is speaking before me. And it was so emotional. These are survivors, primarily survivors of sexual assault or family and friends supporting the survivors. And the tears and the signs and the somber kind of tone there was just so incredibly powerful and vibrant. And then we marched to the church office and given the Me Too movement and given this whole fiasco with Mormon Leaks that had just happened, who comes out to greet 2,000 sexual assault survivors is the PR department. They couldn't even have like a lesser general authority come out and accept these stories that had been gathered. And on top of it, they have the gall to tell people, oh, please don't touch the building. This is a brick. This is like a brick, huge building in the middle of Salt Lake City. This was a very peaceful march. Nobody was being rowdy. I think maybe people were like leaning up against the building or don't touch the building. These are people who've been touched criminally by assaulters, and they have the gall to make a comment about don't touch the building. It was so awful. It was so awful. It was such an awful response given the climate and what they could have done as an opportunity to really kind of step up to the plate.
Wow. So what's coming up for me, which kind of goes into a little bit of what we might still talk about, is I think you asked a question at the beginning of this, Natasha, like what, I can't remember how you worded it. My brain is super shutting down right now, but like a huge problem that I see is that the church does not know how to talk about sexuality, anything outside of, a healthy marriage is just equated in the same bucket, right? So like Elder Cook or President Cook, he said this last conference, right? Where he was talking about, he made the comment about non-consensual sexual activity. Is that how he put it? Like
he said non-consensual immorality, which is where I was going next. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, yeah, it's a perfect segue really, because they don't, the way you're describing the approach with victims of sexual assault by the thousands downtown, the first and kind of largely their second response through the PR department through this former MTC president, and then to just put the icing on the cake to equate, as Elder Cook did, he said non-consensual sexual immorality in the same breath as, as he tells everyone that we need to also be as, on guard with just any sexual immorality.
Exactly.
The concern, the just clear, what was so concerning to me about that was that it even put it in the same ballpark as sexual assault and rape, which is what we should call it.
Yeah, I can't, with this all blowing up in their face, the fact that they really don't understand that this is incredibly triggering to sexual abuse victims and survivors, and to have really nothing spoken of in the entire general conference except for this one sentence by Elder Cook, which really was very inappropriate and very lacking. I think members were looking for something, some type of acknowledgement, some type of response. I mean, this is what I've heard from people, after general conference, was just such sadness and it's like a re-victimization. It's a re-traumatization when your tribe, when your people can't acknowledge what's happened, can't take responsibility for not protecting, and can't take responsibility for not doing more for the victims in these situations. And so it was not only like just so minimal as far as what was addressed, but then the way it was addressed on top of it was just so awful.
It would have been better for him not to mention it, I think.
At all. Right. At all.
It also shows this really immature approach to sexuality.
Absolutely.
That as a grown man, you can't even say the words rape, sexual assault, words that need to be spoken, because we need to have a clear delineation that those things are not okay. So when you use these kind of vague terms, it makes it hazy about what exactly he means by that, right? And I think it continues to protect perpetrators, right? Say the words rape. Rape is not okay. Like rape, we do not do it, right? Do not sexually assault women, right? These are the words that need to be spoken from the pulpit.
Do not
so that it's very clear.
Yes.
Very clear to say these things are not okay. In this climate that we're in, we need to be very clear that our position as the leaders of this church, that these things are not okay. Be clear about the words. These made up words, this is a made up phrase, right? I've never heard this before.
It's right? Not a thing. That's what I thought in my head. It's like, it's not a thing. That's not a thing.
Through
my head. Yeah.
And that needs to be our new bumper sticker.
Yes,
Non-consensual
that's not a thing.
immorality is not a thing.
Not a thing.
It's not a
Yeah.
thing. It's a made up thing. It's a made up word,
And-
you know?
Yes. And it's not to ever be mentioned in the same breath as run-of-the-mill sexual immorality, like what
Yeah,
they would
it's
be
the same.
concerned about with a temple recommend question. Like that
Yeah,
is,
it's the same thing as using the virtue, like the
Yes.
scripture for virtue of talking about these women that were raped in the Book of Mormon, right?
Yes.
And it's like we use the scripture to kind of to tell women that they need to have virtue, right?
Mhm, mhm.
It's these kind of little gets me angry. So
It does, yes.
Take a deep breath and keep on going, because that's what I've been doing.
Yeah. So it makes me angry. It makes me feel like I want more maturity from my leaders that way,
Yes.
you know.
Well, and let me also mention that I did have to hear the word pornography twice on Easter Sunday. So they do have the ability to say words that I'd rather not have my children hear or hear myself on Easter Sunday. But for some reason, we can't say these other words that are, you know, criminal and violent and that people really need protection from, instead of this kind of porn panic that we're helping to create in our culture that makes, you know, that whole issue so much worse for everybody involved. So yeah, it was maddening to me on so many levels that, yeah, it's hard because, again, when they say they don't have the resources, you know, and I'm sure, you know, that a lot of people say, well, these are good men and, you know, maybe they're older or they're well-meaning. And I, for a long time, was willing to give them those passes. But I know a lot of really old people who are smart as a whip, are advocates, and are educated. I mean, we know
And
them in our own sex
teachable is the
therapy
word.
field, right? And
The word I want to use is teachable too.
Yes.
and teachable.
Right. Because
Yes.
it's okay to be teachable. It's okay to say, I don't know a lot about rape culture. I don't know a lot about transgender issues. It's okay to be able to say, I don't know. Can you teach me? So that I can be informed. So I can be informed, right? And I don't think that curiosity is limited to an age.
Mm-mm.
Absolutely not. I mean, think about some of the people that we have in our own, you know, I think of Carolyn Pearson. I think of my own mother. I think of like the Givens. I think of like, there's so many super intellectual, interesting people who are just, you know, thriving with ideas. And then on top of it, I know that we have resources galore to, as long as we're willing to ask for help, there's so many people that would be willing to help our church, you know, catch up in this regard. So I can't ever give them a pass anymore. It's just not okay.
No. One of the things that's coming up for me is there might be some people listening saying, well, what do you want? What do you think would be great? And I mean, there are so many avenues we could go down and it all there. But one that's coming up for me is to have a community in the church that can hold space for all different types of experiences. So what this showed to me is that the church is not ready to hold space for people who have that have been through sexual assault or rape or and have been incredibly marginalized by the power structures that are in place right now. And so, I mean, my heart hurts when I hear you were told to not touch the building. That is such a clear indicator of we are not holding space for your stories here.
Yeah.
You know, when the first response in the news from the church, there was no space for her to have legitimacy. It was a quieting, delegitimizing, not our, you know, this is not our story. She's the problem. There's no space for her story here. And
Right.
that I yearn for that day, and I will do my best to help it get there, because we need to have a community where there is space for all different types of stories and experiences.
I agree. And
Amen.
as we move from that, I'm going to share a little story that I told you both about. You know, I get pinged all the time as far as people messaging me, and I try to get back to everybody. I'm not sure I do a great job at that, but I wrote a blog post talking about a wife who was trying to help her husband and the sexual abuse that he had endured through a family member. I think it was, I want to say an uncle or an older cousin. I forget now. But basically now, many years later, that particular perpetrator, and we're not talking about like a 2 or 3 year difference. We're talking about like 16, 17, 18-year-old with a 5-year-old, right? So very concerning pattern there that happened for this man. And so they reached out to me because now this perpetrator has become the bishop in his current ward. And so this man who this had happened to had never told anybody, including his wife, about this sexual abuse. But because his perpetrator became the bishop, he felt like he had to finally say something to protect others. So they reached out to me, what could they do? What was my thoughts? They wanted to speak to their stake president and et cetera. So let me just give you their update that I just got actually today. I'm so sorry to bother you again. This is the wife, but as you thought it might, it did not go well. My husband set up an appointment and met with his uncle in his own bishop's office. He wanted to go alone, so I was in the car outside. He told his uncle that he remembered what he had done to him as a child, and his uncle denied it. He said he remembered that they had spent a lot of time together back then, but that he couldn't remember anything inappropriate happening between them. My husband said that his uncle seemed very cold, unemotional, not surprised or shocked. He said it felt like he had the story prepared and that he seemed prepared to be confronted by anyone. We tried to meet with this uncle's stake president that night, but we and our stake president were not able to get a hold of him. We did tell our stake president about this response, and he said he was dumbfounded, that we should give the spirit a few weeks to work on him. I'm just going to pause there for a minute because oofda, I just see this, we're trying to solve real issues with spiritual types of solutions. In the meantime, this man is a current bishop. Okay, so let's just think about that for a minute. Okay, so our president got in touch with the other stake president the next day and told us he would call us. Long story, but after being basically blown off by this other stake president, we never met with him. We hadn't heard from anyone about anything being done. So my husband reached out again to our stake president, who said he hadn't heard anything and had just assumed we had met with the other stake president and that everything was being handled. He called and spoke again with this other stake president and was told that the uncle did reach out to his own stake president and that it, quote unquote, came up. He is denying it, so the other stake president just doesn't know what to do. So basically, nothing is being done. Our stake president did offer for us to meet with a general authority who he actually contacted when we first told him. This general authority is the area authority and is over both stakes involved, as we only live about 40 miles apart. So these are they're in the Book of Mormon belt. However, he told us that when he contacted the general authority, that our stake president told the general authority the story, didn't tell him who, but that it was a bishop in his area. And the general authority's initial response was, well, we all do things when we are young.
Wow.
So he cautioned us that we may just get some great ministering and some counsel, but that probably nothing was going to be done to remove this uncle as the bishop. So we are just trying to figure out where to go from here. Both of the stake presidents don't know what to do, and so it seems like nothing will be done. We have tried to go through the church and listen to what the priesthood leaders are saying, but at this point, we don't know what to do. It's so frustrating. I'm reaching out to you again. They're reaching out to me, right? Like, what the heck am I supposed to do about it? But they're reaching out to me, and I'm glad they are because it lets at least this story be told, and I have permission from them to talk about this tonight, to see if you have any insight into how much of a danger this uncle really is. My husband can remember specific grooming behavior and of the behavior escalating. He doesn't remember age exactly, but around 5 or 6 when his uncle was about 16 to 18, and that it happened multiple times, and that he specifically told him that if he told anybody, he would get into trouble. He remembers having these memories through his whole life as a child and as a preteen and a teen, and all the stages and how he thought about them, like not wanting to get into trouble as a child, not wanting his friends to know as a preteen, etc. And he said he would be willing to talk to you to tell you specifics if it would help. Is it possible for someone to truly forget something like that? In other words, could the uncle have really forgotten that he perpetrated this younger cousin of him? We just don't know how far we need to pursue this. We don't really care about him being excommunicated. It's just the fact that he's a bishop meeting alone with youth. And after listening to your recent podcasts, especially the one with the former bishop, we're concerned about our legal responsibility to report him. Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Oh my Lanta. What a hot mess. I mean,
Wow.
I would love to hear just your thoughts as I read this out loud.
My initial thoughts is just like the hot potato that's going on. Like everyone's like, it's not mine. It's not mine. No, it's the general authority. No, this stake president. Like it's like no one's wanting to take accountability to say, we need to look at this. Which again, this bigger conversation of how, like, you know, Joseph Bishop, you know, it's just that like no one wants to really actually say, what is happening here? Do we need to look at this? Right? This theme of like not taking accountability, right?
Yeah.
So that's the, like, when you're talking about this, I'm like, no one's wanting to say, we really need to look at this. And it's problematic. It is a problem.
Well, and I will say right out front that I do think that this is a reportable issue. Here's a person who's been promoted to work with children, who has perpetrated children in the past.
Yeah.
I think that's a reportable issue.
I do too. And the age difference between that is significant. It's not just something that you do, you know, I mean, very normal for kids to do discovery play with each other when they're, you know, within a year or two of each other. That's very normal. Yes. But when it's 17 and 18 and a 5 or 6 year old, that age gap is significant. Right.
Yep.
And it's very normal for perpetrators to deny that they've done this. So when, you know, they describe the cold and collected response and that he very much came to his own defense, that's very normal. I mean, who wants to say, oh yeah, you're right, I did that? And I mean, most of the time perpetrators, I mean, it's a whole nother show we could do, but they're suffering, they're having all kinds of issues, and they've become very kind of compartmentalized. They've become very isolated in being able to talk about their sexuality. They understand that they're at risk of themselves and their whole livelihood, right? And so this is a very scary position for them to be in. They're not going to come forward and say, oh yeah, I'm so sorry I did that, 20 years ago.
Yep.
Yeah. The accountability is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And scary, and the reputation, and then being released as bishop when you just got put in as bishop,
Oh yeah. It's a whole mess for him. So I understand why he would be self-protective, and yet that doesn't mean that he's not remembering.
Absolutely. And I think that you gave great advice because you did a blog post on this, right? Didn't I read that?
I did an initial blog post just of how to initially deal with it, right?
But what I think I really appreciated in there that you said, it was like saying, you being concerned about him isn't what needs to be addressed here, right? Just
Absolutely.
like worrying about how he's going to feel about this, or the consequences that are going to happen to him for this couple coming forward, and particularly this man that was molested coming forward with the story, right?
Yeah.
They don't need to be worrying about the perpetrator.
And again, what I think that the leadership here is missing is that this man who just told his wife just a few weeks ago, for the first time ever in his entire life, and now is telling these leaders about sexual assault, is in of itself such a huge step in his own life. He's only motivated to do that, to break that secrecy that he's held for so long, because he's trying to be protective of, people in this person's ward. Like, these answers that they're giving this man are so incredibly re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
Because here's a man who at one point, sexual assault was a space where he had no control, no power, no ownership. And guess what he's re-experiencing right now?
Yes.
One of the things that this points to me to is how, and I think all three of us really deeply understand this from what we do for our jobs, but how important it is for us for our stories to be heard and to feel recognized by those that we care about, by our community. And so when we start, if someone is going through something, which he is now, her husband, where he is sharing his story with the church that it sounds like he cares deeply about, and then is starting to get this sneaky feeling that he is not even being recognized, can be so devastating and so just like knife through the heart. And I think that's one of the things that I just comes screaming to me when I read that response, Natasha.
I don't even know these people. I mean, like, it's not like I've ever even spoken with them on the phone.
Right.
Like a message that they Facebook messaged me.
Right. I mean, and that's like, I mean, again, like, it speaks to this idea of like, people are coming to you as a person, as a resource over the people that should be actually taking care of them. Yes. You get what I'm saying? It angers me. Yeah. And it's just like, I just think it speaks volumes, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that there's no one advocating for survivors, except like they know that Natasha will advocate for them. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, what is wrong with the system? It's so broken. This is evident of the brokenness of it, right?
Absolutely.
You have someone that's saying, this bishop molested me when I was a kid, and I haven't spoken to it for my whole freaking life. But he has become a bishop, and I need to speak to that. And finally, I'm speaking up for it, right? I'm like so proud of him. Like, how scary to have a secret like that, even from your wife, for all of those years, and then finally being able to speak to it, and nobody listens to you. And they're just like, oh, you'll probably get good ministering too. That's bullshit. That is not ministering. That is not ministering, right? Mm-hmm. Whoever this general authority is, I'm just like, what? We do things in our youth? No. This is not something you do. This is not normal. This grooming behavior, him telling it's a secret, he's going to get in trouble, right? Like all this stuff. It's just, it's so gross. It's egregious. So gross. It's horrible. And then the fact that they have not moved on it, and it's been a couple weeks.
That's right.
And they're reaching out to you again because they still haven't been heard.
Exactly. Because nothing has happened.
And I'll just say to this couple, because I know they're listening to this, I told them that we talk about it, and they're like, okay, well, we'll be glad to listen. But I'm so glad you reached out to me. I mean, I don't want you to ever consider that you shouldn't have done that. I'm just saying, what the heck, right? Like, why? Like, there should have been so many more resources for you than reaching out to somebody, in Kansas when, you live in the mountain region. It's just...
Well, and if nothing else, I hope that they hear that we hear them. We hear him. And there are a lot of people like us that instantly hear it. It's not even a question. Hear his story. We instantly, without having gone through it ourselves, we're there with them immediately.
And how brave it is.
Yeah.
How brave it is.
I'm totally leaving your bullshit comment in, Amy, because I'm a huge proponent of righteous anger. Huge.
I just think it's very brave and very scary. And the fact that he's being ignored, it breaks my heart. And it continues this theme that we hear over and over again. And we do not need to continue to protect the institution. The institution's fine. We can be transparent. We can say people make messy mistakes. That's not a reflection on the institution. It's a reflection on people doing things that are against, like, morality, against the goodness of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. We need to protect individuals.
And even basic HR departments, when these kinds of concerns come up, they'll put somebody on like paid leave, from the perspective of like, well, we don't
investigate this case.
Yeah. We don't want to necessarily assume that you're guilty, but at the same time, we can't continue with this, accusation that's been put forward. We can't continue to have you in this role where you could, potentially hurt other people. I mean, that's just basic HR practice at any business in the United States.
That is a great point.
It's, you could say to a bishop, well, yeah, this is a really horrible thing that's come to light, and we don't know if it's true or not, but for the time being, we're going to have to put you on leave. And yes, maybe that's unfair and that's sad and upsetting, but we can't continue to lean on the side of, oh, the perpetrator must be innocent.
Right.
When you potentially have more victims and you're re-traumatizing victims from the past.
And being a judge of Israel.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine the anxiety that this man is feeling. And plus he went and actually spoke to his own uncle, because he told me he didn't just want the stake president showing up and telling him. And this is somebody that he has a family relationship with, right? So this is complicated because there's feelings of, love and commitment and loyalty. And yet there's this huge crime that's been a family secret, for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And that's a very typical position people are in, So he went and confronted his bishop, or his uncle gave him the chance to basically say, hey, like, I'm going to talk about this and I need to, tell you in person. And I'm
It's so scary for people to do that. Anyone that I've ever sat with, as they've like worked through sexual trauma, and then they're going to go and they're going to like talk to the person that did it or confront them or write a letter or whatever it is an agonizing process for them to do that, to face the person. It sounds like he, like in the post you talked about how he's like worked through it with his mission. He hadn't told anybody. The fact is, anybody that shows up that has sexual trauma, there's so much shame about that happening. Right. And, in our work, we kind of help people unpack that shame and what it means and all that kind of stuff. So for him to kind of have worked through a lot of that and then to have to face this uncle, I just think it's so scary, and people don't realize like how hard and scary that is.
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying. And so I think he's so brave. I'm so proud of him. If you're listening, I'm so proud of you. It's really a hard process to kind of face predators. And especially the fact that it is complicated with the fact that this man's family. Yeah. So you're putting a huge ripple in so many family relationships. Why can't you just stay quiet? Did it really happen? Are people going to believe you? All the things that come with that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
reason why people stay, silent for years. It's an understandable fear.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for kind of talking through this with me, because I just read it today, the response. So it was very good timing to be able to talk to the two of you about it as well. Which, by the way, for those who are listening, this is what we're supposed to be doing in our jobs, is colleague networking and consultation and discussing. It doesn't matter that I've been practicing for 20 some years or whatever. Like, it's an ongoing check your biases, check your facts, check your practice, check your techniques, because otherwise we're in a potential space to do a lot of harm when that's not intentional. And see, that's the difference between mental health professionals and bishops, is that we are ethically and through our licensure mandated to do that type of work of checking ourselves. And if not, we can lose our license, rightfully so. It's so important to do.
It is.
Accountability.
All right, ladies, thank you so much for your time. Any closing thoughts from either one of you? I'd love to get some.
I think wanting things to be better is not a problem. It's not, I think a lot of people might listen to us doing this and saying, oh, you guys are just so critical. And I just think, I think it's because we deeply want the system to not be broken, to not be harmful to people. Like, that is at least my intention when talking about these issues. Right. Mm-hmm. It's not that I'm trying to like find every single fault in this, but I do expect people in leadership and power to be better. And when you how do you be better, right? Like, you gotta be better. And it just is like how pushing change and pushing conversations. I think it really opens up the awareness. And I think that's important. I think that's what a lot of these things are doing, is opening up awareness and being open to be teachable around these sexual issues. I think is vital for a system to start healing and to start to grow. Right. And that's what I hope for this. I don't like the stories that come onto my couch about this stuff. Like, I want it to end. I want it to end. Yeah. And that's what I think having these conversations hopefully strive to do, is to say, how do we make people in power accountable for their actions?
And if there was less defensiveness from the church, we wouldn't have to be critical. Then it would just be a joint venture.
Oh, if they had responded differently, I want it to be like, I am so proud of that response. Look at that. You know, like I genuinely want that, you know, where I'm like, well, somebody's eyes were on that really understands the complications of mental health and sexual abuse. And they did such a great job responding to that. And they didn't re-victimize her, and they didn't, you know, or him, depending on who it might be, you know, boys get abused too. It's not just a women issue. So I think my closing thoughts is just that I know that we could be better as an institution, and being able to say, how do we continue to work towards change and work towards accountability, I think is completely an honorable cause that we're all engaged in. So that's my final thoughts. I get a little passionate. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you. Bring it, Amy. Thank you. Kristen, what about you?
I like your passion, Amy.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking, just what are my closing thoughts? You know, all of our other podcasts we've done together, Natasha, I think it's going to be kind of a strikingly different tone on it. And I think that that's really appropriate. I'm proud of that, because this topic crosses so many lines for me, on a personal level, on a professional level, on just a ethical, moral level. And so I think that there is an appropriate place for anger and frustration. And I think that compassion can be very fierce. And I embrace that type of fierceness. My heart hurts out of compassion, and it takes a lot of strength to do what you do, Natasha, what you do, Amy. And I think that there is room for being quite upset about this. And I hope that it's podcasts like these and through other voices that will start holding, either forcing the church to be accountable for this, or will naturally take place in order for it to become a safer, better, fuller, you know, place for our community. And I hope that this will help take it to that place.
And I would just add to your work as well, Kristen. So thank you for that. All right. Well, thank you both for your time and your energy tonight. I really appreciate it. And we will, I'm sure, meet again to talk about more Mormon sex things. Hopefully it'll be back to lighter topics in the future, or not. You know, we're willing to continue to address this, obviously, as much as it's necessary. But I appreciate you talking about the difference in tone, Kristen, and all the passion that both of you brought. So thank you for all of that. For those of you who are listening, please consider donating to this resource that we're trying to have for you past the year 2018, where we talk about these very important things, really from a mental health perspective, from a wellness perspective, from a healthy lifestyle perspective. That's so much about what we're all very passionate about who come on this show. We really want to help people embrace Mormonism or non-Mormonism, wherever you're at on the spectrum, but understanding that Mormonism has played a role in your life, and that it can, you know, be a healthy part of who you are and how you frame things currently. So please consider donating. Hope you've enjoyed the podcast. And with that, I'll say good night to everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing hard.